Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen.
Lord God, I love you above all things, and I love my neighbor for your sake, because you are the highest, infinite, and perfect good, worthy of all my love. I love my neighbor, especially those in need, because they are made in your image and dignity. I intend to live and die in your love. Amen.
Today, we're going to be looking, the council now has moved to its final session, and it will end in December of 1965. The final session is going to deal with a lot of documents. Some we've already looked at, have been promulgated, but we use them at different times in class. But a key document that will be there in the final session is the Pastoral Constitution of the Church in the Modern World. If you recall, the document on the church has the adjective dogmatic constitution, and this one has pastoral constitution. And it's a code word that's going to tell us its purpose is different than the other document. The other document is, if you will, an articulation in a systematic way of what we believe. But this document is going to talk about the mission of the church and how the church is going to express that. Again, remember the principle of the council, which was made at the end of the first session, that all documents in some way must connect to the document of the church. So there's not like a separate document, it's a document on there. So in the language of formal theology, we talk about the church ad intra, which is Latin term, which means to go inside, but we also speak of the church ad extra, the church that goes outside. When we matters of ad intra are things that, such as dogma, the sacraments, laws of, when we're talking about ourselves, it's an introverted view, a necessary view. But the church also relates to external matters such as the political order, social issues, culture as an influence on the life of Catholics and on people of goodwill. So the council decides early on, which we'll look at it in a minute, that it's going to also speak ad extra. This is a unique thing that the Second Vatican Council does. When we look at all the councils of the church, the 22 that come before, it does not speak ad extra. It speaks ad intra. You're dealing with Arius or Nestorius and these heretics that we don't, I'm sorry, I even use their name, and they're always dealing with these people. These are internal matters, but they're not talking about the social conditions of people and stuff. So this is going to be another unique thing about the Second Vatican Council. And if we look at this, it's all part of the mystery that is the church. Because Christ, it cannot be exhausted just with dogma, sacraments, and rules. Christ is also in a state of mission, and the church, where Christ dwells, is in a state of mission. So with that view, this schema, first it was called schema 17, which schema means draft in Latin, okay? But it ultimately becomes schema 13 for a number of administrative reasons. And it's the group that's commissioned to work on it is the Commission of the Laity. So this commission is going to have a lot of lay people on it, because by the third session of the council, Paul VI is appointing lay people, including religious women, to come to the council. Now, if you recall in the very first class, all periti experts have to have an imprimatur. And so they have to go through the congregation of the Holy Office Inquisition to be approved. And this was a way to keep them out of the council. So all these names are being sent to Cardinal Ottaviani and his staff, but they're not getting the imprimaturs. So as usual, an end run is made, and Paul VI says, I give them the imprimatur, so they all can go. And one of the person I knew, and some of you may know, Sister Luke Tobin, she was there at the council there. And when she arrived, Cardinal Ottaviani said, "Dear, we're so glad you're here. These are a lot of heady things you really don't have to come to say." But anyway, by this time, the log jam has been overcome, and we have lay people, and we have religious sisters. So remember, the religious men were there. The superior generals of the major orders were there, and voters. So, and it's still in the synods of bishops, they still come, yes.
So when you say lay people, was that men and women?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Can you believe it? They even let them in. So, ultimately, the schema is going to have three parts, and this is what we're going to see in the final. There's going to be an introduction or a preface, which is going to deal with a term brought up by John the 23rd, reading the signs of the times. Now, it's not an original thing, because in the scripture, if you recall, Jesus chides the Jews, and he says, you know when the wind blows from the south, it's going to get hot. And when the clouds come from the east or the west, I think he says, there's going to be rain. He says, you can tell the weather, but you can't read the signs of the time, which is the appointed time of his coming. So John the 23rd, in some of his purple media, often talked about the council must read the signs of the times. And then there's going to be part two, principles, and then part one, and then part two, principles, and then some urgent problems. So that's going to be the basic framework of this document as we go along. Now, the prime movers of the document, and this starts in the first session, that's why we have this kind of notation. There's Cardinal Sunens, who is the Cardinal Primate of Belgium, of Brussels. It's a hyphenated diocese. Cardinal Locarno, who is in the Cardinal of Bologna, Cardinal Leger of Montreal, Canada, and Cardinal Montini, later Paul VI. In the first session, they say we cannot have such an event and not say anything to the world. There has to be agenda, and that's when it becomes Schema 17, which will ultimately become that. So they call for the council to look outside of itself, not just to look inside. And remember, ecumenism was part of the agenda, but in the theology ad intra, the unification of the Christian churches is an ad intra issue. It's about the church's membership, so it's inside of us. So that is not considered outside. This is other things. Some of the key people was Marie Dominique Chenu, who was a Dominican, kind of a crusty old lady, died well almost at 100, and wrote an article the day before he died. Bernard Herring, who was a redemptorist, a German. Chenu is French. Herring is a German redemptorist who spent his life teaching at the Alfonsinum in Rome, which specializes in moral theology. Jean Danielou, who later becomes a cardinal, and Monsignor Pavin, who is one of these people that some people know about. He was the scribe of John the 23rd, and he basically crafted Magna and Magister and Pacem Terris. And I think I've mentioned to you before, when encyclicals are written, usually a person or a number of people are appointed to craft the draft, and then the Pope ultimately appropriates it to himself and make changes or not. And in the craft of academic theology, when you study these documents, one of the things you want to do is to find out who the scribe was, because then you get a broader view of their thought. And so if you read their own articles, you can kind of get an idea of what they're saying more fully. And so they were pushing this as theologians at the council. But two who were pushing against, who will be kind of critical people, is Fathers Trump and Father Lino. Now, Trump is a Jesuit in the Congregation of the Inquisition, and it's still called that. And Lino is a consultant to the Congregation of the Inquisition. He's a OFM Franciscan, and he teaches moral theology at the Franciscan University. Okay, now remember the two tendencies. This tendency is the pastoral dynamic group, and this here is the juridical institutional group representing these perspectives. And as always in the council, both perspectives are always going to be on there. Now, there's other people here, the bishops, like Cardinal Ottaviani and others will be there as well. Someone of note we'll look at is John Cardinal Dearden of Detroit is on the commission as well. So they're working their way with all these lay people, and I would have given you the names, but I don't think they would mean much to you. But the two people who emerge as very influential is Cardinal Giacomo Liccardo. Now, he's the Bishop of Bologna. If you remember Cardinal Siri, who was the one who was constantly a candidate for Pope, Cardinal Siri makes him his auxiliary. And Cardinal Siri is the main spokesman next to Ottaviani of the institutional juridical view. But he's then sent to Bologna to be the Archbishop and then the Cardinal. And the first thing he does is empty out all the antiques of his palace and sell them and make his palace an orphanage. And he brings the children in, and he becomes the cardinal of the street. Now, Bologna is very important in Italy because it is the center of the CPI, the Communist Party of Italy. And he is willing to engage the leadership of the city, the mayor, who's a communist, about taking care of the poor. And so he's very engaged in politics with the city, and he goes to the city magistrates and advocates for benefits for the poor and stuff like that. So he is often called the Red Cardinal, and not meaning his clothes. Okay? Okay. And he was the alternate candidate to be Pope of the progressive side of the election. It was either going to be Montini, who becomes Paul VI, or him. But people felt he was maybe a little bit too much for to be the Pope. At that time, we weren't quite ready for that. We had to wait till now. Okay, and then we have Leo Sunens, who's from Brussels, and he was always a person into new things, and most people most probably remember him more because he supported the Catholic charismatic movement in the church as a legitimate spirituality, and that before the council, the Holy Office did not like that, and they often people who painted with that are seen as being evangelical Protestant. But he had encouraged groups in his diocese to pray in that way with the charismatic movement. So they become very important. Yes, it's Chenu. It's not a great picture of him, but he wasn't that handsome of a man even in his youth. But he was a type of person and someone to tremble about. Okay? He lived at Saint-Jacques in Paris, which is a very famous house of our order because the people who ultimately had the French Revolution met in our chapter room, and later on, of course, weren't too friendly to us, but the Jacobins, if you ever read them in history, they call that because they were meeting at Saint-Jacques. And he had intimidated the librarians so much that anytime a new book arrived, listen up, every time a new book arrived in the library, he was immediately brought it to him so he could read it. And he sat in his office with a large window behind him. And if he judged the book was worthy of a complete read, he set it there. If it wasn't, he'd throw it behind him into the courtyard. And the poor librarian was running, trying to make sure the books didn't have their spine. So in the latter part of his life, he became kind of a giant caricature for us, and we often we have many Chenu stories. And Bernard Herrick, who was this German redemptorist, he was noted as a very kindly man and very soft-spoken. The latter part of his life, he gets cancer of the throat and lost the ability to speak, and so he had to limit his teaching there as he went along. Okay, now this is another thing we want to know about God. This is all introduction, but it's going to all gel, I promise you. Okay, there's two theological methods used And this doctrinal method, which had been used throughout the council, if you remember, I said always they start with principles. Remember, we talked with the humanism and all the doctrines. It always starts with principles or religious liberty. We start with the dignity of the person as the image of God, and then you work down to certain implications. It's what we call in theology a priori thinking, or in more commonly deductive reasoning, which you're familiar with. This other methodology, which had caused a lot of problems for theologians in the 20th century, though always existed from the 9th century, it was you start with experience and you move towards principles to discover the application. So it's a three-step program. First, you see the situation, then you seek the principles, and then you make an application. And it's a posteriori thinking or inductive reasoning. And this is was identified more with a pastoral approach. And if we look at Jesus in the New Testament, he knew all the law and the prophets. But when he would go about and he met a certain situation, he didn't give them the universal catechism. He chose from that and made an application to this situation. So he first encountered the person and then drew from the treasury of the tradition to speak to the person, who he voted. So these are very ancient methods. But so that this commission, instead of going this way, the rest of them, they said, we're going to go this way. We're going to start with people. So what results in, if I can flick back kind of quick, this section will be written first, and this section will be written second. Now, this section is not original. When the council started, the council wasn't saying anything to the world. So Chenu and Congar went to John the 23rd and said, you're not saying anything to the world. So he said, well, why don't you draft a letter to the people of the earth, and we'll send it in the name of the council. If you look at that letter and you look at this section, you're going to see a lot of connections between the two of them, because they basically use that. So they put this one in, and then they start here. And this is only written last. It looks like 1, 2, 3. But in fact, it's 1, 2, 3 as it goes along. And so we're going to get into some real juicy stuff this morning now because of that. Okay. And I gave you the preface there this morning, and we're just going to look at that for a few seconds there. And it's going to bring out some major questions of theological debate in the early 20th century. The first thing, it begins in kind of like a poetry. It says, and that's in Latin, Gaudium et Spes means joys and hopes. Okay, remember we have Gaudete Sunday during one liturgy. Okay, the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of humanity of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. These are the joys and the hopes and the griefs and the anxieties of the followers of Christ. Indeed, nothing genuine human fails to raise an echo in their hearts. These two sentences take months to get approved. Why? Does that anybody disturb to your foundation to read that? Because in theology that develops by the 17th century, dualisms have entered into the thinking. So we have the spiritual world, the material world. We have the profane world, the sacred world, and they're not the same. And yet there's a consistent view which goes back to the early church fathers. Remember, their method is always to go back to the sources, to the early church fathers, 13th century, the 3rd century to 13th century, that hold that there is just one history. And where you see this sometimes, like, I love you with human love. I love, God loves me with divine love. There's only one love. And so if I love you, in some way I'm expressing my participation in the divine mystery. There's only one history. And that's what Chenu and others, they're coming out of that view and they're saying one history. Trump, Peretti, and others are fighting this view, and they say no. There's a hierarchy. The spiritual world is more important than the temporal world. And in fact, the temporal world can be a distraction from the mystery of salvation. I don't know if you even in your own mind think that, but what happens in the practical thing, if you're a mother and at night you kneel down by the bed and you pray for your children, that's much more important than you feeding your children in the dualistic view. The integrated view would be when you fed the kids and you prayed for the kids and you wiped their little butts and everything else. That's all part of the mystery of participation in the divine life, this integrated view. And this was hotly contested in theology. And that's why in religious life, we left the world. Remember, Sister and I lived on a different planet for a number of years. And then, all of a sudden, bang, the planet crashed into Mother Earth, and we found ourselves back on the planet again. But why did that take so long? Well,
the church moves with glacial speed.
Some of us were heavier in the spaceship than others. Okay. But anyway, we landed. This might seem very simple, but this is a very, very important thing, not only for the document to understand, but in your own spirituality. Do you feel that some things are not so spiritual? And we might say, quoting our brother St. Thomas Aquinas, that even when we pray, we're participating in the divine love because the divine persons play together. So even when you go to a Blackhawks hockey game and they win, you are participating in the divine mystery.
Or the Cardinals, and they win.
Yeah, or the Cardinals, and they should, so they're Catholic there.
I remember that in my growing up and in my training, and it's like at one point they tried to get us to believe that, the human was much lesser than.
Of course, it's a whole school of spiritual
and I always
theology.
had trouble with that.
Yeah.
Always had trouble.
But on the other hand, there are elements in human history that are not of the kingdom
Right.
of God, and we always have to be discerning that we just don't embrace the secular, the profane, in an uncritical manner. But we don't deny the reality of God's mystery in creation, and in particular, we encounter the Father in creation, with God the Father. The second thing in number 2 is they address this not to the church, but to all people. And now it says, hence the Second Vatican Council, having probed more profoundly the mystery of the church. Remember, that's the key concept of Lumen Gentium. The church is a mystery. No matter how much we ponder it, it's still going to escape us and prompt us to dig further, because it's a mystery. Okay? It's elusive in a way. We're always chasing the mystery. Okay. But now, since we did our pondering, now address itself without hesitation, not only to the sons and daughters of the church, but to all who invoke the name of Christ, but to the whole of humanity. Okay. So this audience is going to be sent out, the intention. And then the last part of this is going to reiterate certain things in this introduction, number 3, the situation of the world today, the reading of the signs of the times. And they emphasize 4 aspects of the signs of the times in 1963 to 65. Okay? So in a sense, we might change some of those today, maybe not. The hopes and the anguishes of people. People live in a combination of hope and anguish in the world. That is part of the human experience today. Now, like I said, in 2013, these are not true. Okay? Deep-seated changes at a fast pace are occurring. And they note especially the communication reality of our world. Television is becoming real. News is, remember, the media are reporting. Remember the Christian Century saying, day by day, we're getting the blows from the council. We're getting the news instantly. And that is having an impact upon people in life. There's changes in morals and in religion, the way people think about these things. There's new ideas about what morality is about. And there's a lot of questioning of ultimate meaning. Who are we? Where are we going? Remember those questions that they raised in the document of religious liberty. So they're noting that they're saying, this is the world right now that we live in. Could we say this of, say, the Fourth Lateran Council? Yes and no. I'm sure the Fourth Lateran Council would say people live with hopes and anguishes. But I don't think they would say there's a rapid change going on. It's a very stable feudal society. Morality, the church was the church. There was no Protestants around to confuse us. So we all agreed on these things. So, and of course there would be always a few philosophers in the university asking ultimate questions. So in a sense, what they're doing is they are inserting the church into the present reality. And this is very important for them. But they're not going to stay there. They're going to, so they do this introduction, and I'm going to ask some of my helpers to help me there. Get these out. So I'll start with that. I'm giving these out to you gradually because this is a huge document, and we're not going to be able to look at everything. And I encourage you to read it.
I don't have any.
They're coming.
I guess. So they're the first, they'll be last. See the Samuel.
Now, this is the ordering of the chapters, and we will look through these in time. But the council, the logic they're using, which is from fundamental theology or foundational theology, if you prefer, is, and the church has held this through its moral tradition, that the basic unit of society is the family. That's the key unit. Society exists for the family. So the logic of their thinking that they're going to start with marriage and the family, and then if you see they're going to talk about the systems of culture where we get meaning. So I'm a Dutch boy from a Dutch family, or that type of thing. So we have a cultural identity, and then the material needs of the family, political, and then some particular questions, the whole questions of war and peace, which, remember, we're still in the Cold War, which is very hot at the time. And then there will be a conclusion, which is a call to dialogue, the church to dialogue with the world. So that's kind of the urgent questions section. So now we're going to move into the first section, marriage and the family. And that's the section I just gave you. And here's the history kind of the text. The Curia, remember the Curia had produced documents on everything and sent them out to the bishop before. And their document was called Marriage, Family, and Chastity. It was timeless in some ways because the church, the Judeo-Christian tradition, has always had reference to the two Genesis creation stories. The first one, which deals with fecundity, go forth, multiply, and man and woman is made in the image of God. And the second one is the resolution of Aham, the dirt man, into Ish and Isha, Adam and Eve, and to resolve Aham's loneliness. Okay? So those two are always a reference point. And so to understand marriage, it always had two dimensions to it. Reproduction and the intimacy of spouses and development of home. So that part was, we got to fight with it. But the other part of it was negative, rigoristic, and casuistic in its approach. Now, what does that mean? Well, first of all, the view of human sexuality was negative and on a good day was tolerated for the sake of humanity. That was the tone of it. And it reflected what was also the tone of the Code of Canon Law at the time. It was rigorous casuistry, it's an R missing in there, in its approach, meaning that it took cases and it applied rules to it. Now, within this spectrum of casuism, and that's when I learned moral theory, we used to have cases. If you want next class, I'll bring a little book from 1966 and you can read moral cases that we have to solve each month. And we had a pastoral and a liturgical and a moral case we had when we were young to solve. Within this view, and this we're talking about 17th century development into the 20th century, there were the rigorous, the laxists were the two poles. And in between were the opportunists. And so it was a rigoristi, laxisti, and opportunisti. That's how they refer. Okay. Now, the opportunisti tended to lean toward the rigorous side, but they always determined what was appropriate. And now here's, this is a real, that was taught, that in the reality of human sexuality, in marriage, okay, outside marriage is you strike out. But anyway, in marriage, reproduction, the first purpose, procreative, was primary, and secondary was unitive. So you had a 1-2 thing, and that would give you the template, the grid to solve cases. When they're the rigorist held, and this, I believe it or not, this came in canon law, and I'll tell you, when I was a number, this was in canon law, that anytime someone had sexual relations in marriage and their intention had to be to have children. And if they didn't, it was a sinful act. Now, the gravity was determined by a lot of factors. Okay? Well, of course, if you have had 101 biology, this is a practical question because women tend to be difficult when in their 40s or so and they can't have babies anymore. So what do you do in marriage? Okay? Rigors would say, well, it's time now to start reading books. The laxists would say, they're not denying that purpose, but now nature has changed, and so they can just continue to practice the second purpose. And so they're laxists. The opportunist would say, it's true what they're saying, it can only be for reproduction, but if the people don't know it, don't tell them. Or do not disturb a peaceful conscience. Okay? So, and that's the world I was trained in moral theology. There's a lot of things that are, you just don't stir up the sand about, okay? They're operating, they're having a great time, they're in their 90s and they're two little cooing doves, leave them alone, okay? But then if she wants grounds for a divorce, you can say, well, he's been violating canon law for years. The other thing about the document, the draft, which was upsetting and was also expressed in canon law, that the woman's body was really the property of a husband. And it said that a woman could never deny her husband except for grave reason, which usually was terminal illness. And so if a husband said, let's go, that had to go, and that was it. And it would work. It had to be a real big one. Okay.
A migraine.
But this is what these cases, this casuistry, that's what they're looking at all these little cases all the time, and they're taking the rules and applying to them. Well, the document was like that. But if you remember, the bishops threw all those documents out. This one was never discussed in its rejection in the first session. It was when the big ones, the one on the church and stuff, got blown out of the council after debate. They just threw the whole bunch out. And this document on marriage, family, and chastity gets blown away. And if you look at the title of chapter 1, that alone is going to tell you where they go to. fostering the nobility of marriage and the family. It's a little bit different twist. You think? Okay. And so this joint committee now is going to be formed between the Theological Commission and the lay apostolate. They will draft the new constitution. And so they get together. Now remember, the Theological Commission has some very, very strong personalities on both sides of the tendencies. So you have Bronner, Congar, people like that, and you have Trump, Peretti, Tarbiani, back and forth. So Lino, who's this Franciscan, remember he teaches in the university room and a consultant to the Congregation of the Holy Office, he is put on the commission. There's a Bishop McGrath, and don't be fooled by his name. He's the Archbishop of Panama City, and he's not, he's Irish by descent, but he's Panamanian, and he's on the commission. He also, there was a commission held on the problem of population in the world, which ultimately will get subsumed into this commission. And he's on this one and this one. Well, they start the direction that they're going to take, and they're starting to craft this document. And Lino keeps on producing. And then, by the way, I didn't show you pictures of him or Trump because there's none on the Google. We can't find him. I mean, they never put their picture up on Google. But he keeps on presenting new texts for consideration, which are being crafted, we know from what's on his journal, by him, Michael Brown, and Anacheta Fernandez, and people like that are working in the office making these new texts. But what is happening, the document arrives, and then the commission has to deal with the document. How do you get that out so we can keep working? Well, there's letters being exchanged between Archbishop McGrath and Lino, which are unbelievable. And he basically says, you're about the worst thing that ever happened to the church. And this one's saying, no, you're about the worst thing that happened to the church. And it becomes so explosive that Paul VI sends them each a postcard saying, I'm aware that you're at the council, more or less. And that was the end of the letters. But it shows, it's a little tip of the iceberg. What was going on, this fighting going back and forth. So after that, there's no more alternative text being proposed from the Theological Commission. That this commission now takes its work on as it works there, as it goes. So in this chapter that they will finally do, and these numbers match the Concilia paragraphs numbers, they're going to take the title, which we just looked at, the nobility of marriage in the family, using that method of starting with experience is the general situation of marriage today. The first thing, they're not going to talk about marriage, Adam and Eve. They're going to start talking about how people live marriage today, what your marriage looks like, and so forth. So that's going to be their starting point, experience. Then they're going to go, what is our theological vision of marriage and sexuality? What do we have? Not in these different schools. We're not going to go rigorous. We're not going to go laxist or opportunist. We're going to go to the sources. What is the plan of the Creator? You see how that theologically is well. Then particular character of love in marriage. Then the begetting of children, the size of the family, and the family is the school of a deeper humanity. Okay, so these 5 sections are going to develop what the church is pastorally going to approach. So let's first, and now this document, that was passed out just now, and it's 6 pages. I found a way on the Vatican's website just to get what I want out of it rather than printing the whole blessed thing out, so I'm not killing the forest. Okay. The well-being of the individual person and of human and Christian society is intimately linked with a healthy condition of the community that produces the family and marriage. Okay. That's the basic unit, and that's very traditional Catholic thought, and most sociological, I can tell you, sound. Since Christians and all people who hold this community in high esteem sincerely rejoice in the various ways by which they today help foster this community of love and perfecting its life, and by which parents are assisted in this lofty calling. Those who rejoice in such age look for additional benefits from them and labor to bring them about. And then it says, yet the excellence of this institution is not everywhere reflected with equal brilliance. And they talk about different things, like polygamy, the plague of divorce, so-called free love. Now, those of us who lived in the 60s, we remember free love. You know? If you didn't go see Hair sometime, the movie or something, you'll get the drift. And other disfigurements obscuring this, okay? So they're saying that people value it, but there's also this other trend that's going on. All these situations produce anxiety of consciences. Yet the power and the strength of the institution of marriage and family can also be seen in the fact that time and again, despite difficulties, the profound changes in modern thought reveal the true character of this institution in one way or the other. So they're not going to buy in to a pessimistic view. Remember John the 23rd in the opening, he says, these pessimistic voices, we're not going to listen to you. So they're saying, yes, we have problems. But there's also glimmers of hope there as well. Therefore, by presenting certain key points of church doctrine in a clearer light, this Sacred Synod wishes to offer guidance and support to those Christians and others who are trying to preserve the holiness and foster the natural dignity of marriage state and its superlative value. So again, in terms of methodology, remember, you have the situation, and then you draw from the theological treasure of the church, and you take certain things and apply it. And so that's, you see how they're using that methodology as they're going on? Very different than the other documents we looked at. Number 48. Here is a great solution to people who have been working on the theology of marriage, but it also creates a bigger problem later. Because in this text here, the two purposes, the unitive and the procreative, are not flipped as they were. So before you had one, reproduction, two, unity, but they're going to say they're equal, but they're going to argue that reproduction flows from the love of unity, that the child is a product of this purpose. It's a priority. At first, the love of the man and the woman united with God bring forth life. It's not the child brings forth the marriage, though sometimes it does, but it's generally pastorally not recommended to approach it that way. So, and all of these words that are there, that's what is happening theologically. So does that make any sense? I mean, is it okay? You understand where they go? Okay. So the intimate partnership of married life and love has been established by the Creator and qualified by His laws, is rooted in the conjugal covenant of irrevocable personal consent. So we start off with the love of this man and woman who are going to enter into this permanent covenant through their consent. So first you got to have mom and dad, okay? And they're going to, hence, by that human act whereby spouses mutually bestow and accept each other, a relationship arising from the divine will, and in the eyes of society too, is a lasting one. Now, sexuality is going to be always kind of put a little sweetness on it there, so you know what we're talking about, this intimate behavior. For the good of spouses and their offsprings as well as society, the existence of the sacred bond no longer depends on human decisions alone, for God himself is the author of matrimony, okay? So that's why we call it sacramental. When I taught undergraduates in the university, I used to say, you might have heard it takes two to tango. What does that mean? And they all do. And I said, it's a lie. It takes three to tango.
Mhm.
And even when it's unexpected or even in horrendous situations, when life is breathing, there's always a third person involved, a divine person. So even a child who comes out of maybe a violent situation, God still is there with that child. So we don't lose sight of that. So therefore, they develop this further, and they're talking about human sexuality in an extremely positive way. So if we move down the paragraph, by the very nature, the institution of matrimony itself and conjugal love are ordained for procreation and the education of children, and find in them the ultimate crown. So first they've dealt with the love between the people, and now it proceeds to reproduction. Thus a man and woman, by their compact of conjugal love, are no longer two but one flesh, render mutual help and service to each other through the intimate union of their persons and their actions. Through this union, they experience the meaning of their oneness and obtain to it with growing perfection day by day. As a mutual gift of two persons, this intimate union and the good of children impose total fidelity of spouses and argue for the unbreakable oneness between them. So it's a different view than what we see in the canons and in the manuals. Now, most of you know what I'm talking about when I talk about the manuals. Remember, I passed one around one day, and you saw how to take care of people from the manuals. So this is a different view. It's moving beyond it. And then he says, Christ the Lord abundantly blesses this many-faceted love. So it's not a prudish document. If we turn to page 2, and this I would say to you, if you're ever teaching marriage prep, if you're into anything like that, or baptismal prep, or just teaching young people about human sexuality, you might want to come to that. Authentic married love is caught up in the divine love. And this is something we're over and over challenged. That, I mean, if I was teaching crusty undergraduates, I would joke more with you. But I used to say to people, you know, when a married couple comes to church, you say, I'm very happy you're coming to church to participate in the sacrament of the Eucharist. I hope you're participating in the sacrament of matrimony frequently at home. Meaning, I hope you're having a lot of sex. Because that is a sacramental experience for the married couple. And this document is bringing this out. Authentic love is caught up into the divine love. So that man and woman are experience an event, just as when I go to Eucharist and I experience the event of encounter with Christ, they are experiencing a divine event. And that spirituality of human sexuality has not been emphasized after the council, in my opinion, sufficiently in marriage preparation. But we are called as married men and women, not sister and I, but you, and those of you who are in the marriage state, to become mystics, sensual mystics. That's what the council's calling you to be, sensual mystics. So that intimacy is giving you a glimpse into that incredible love that God has for us. And that is what the councils, and they also bring out that these children, as living members of the children, contribute in their own way to making their parents holy. Well, it certainly teaches you the virtue of patience, I'm sure. And so we go to paragraph 9, and this is all positive theology about marriage and human sexuality. The biblical word of God several times urges the betrothed in the marriage to nourish and develop their wedlock by pure conjugal love and undivided affection. So it's biblical, and they're saying, what we're saying is not, we're just not making this up here for you today. And it develops this ongoing. But now we're going to move to a little bit more controversial thing.
Brother, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Marriage was civil before the council said that was accepted earlier.
I couldn't hear what you said.
Oh, the marriage was a civil act prior to, I think it was, I'm trying to remember the name of the council that said it was a sacrament.
Definitively. The history of the sacrament of marriage.
What I'm asking though is, divine exists with it. Did it exist with it before that declaration, before when it was under a church, outside of the church?
Yes, because it's part of the natural law, and natural law theology would say. But but people were getting married before the church, before Abraham, okay? And that was considered a holy institution in some way or another, and they're often called on their belief system to witness that, but mainly the community. And it's almost to the late third, 4th century, you start to see a practice. The early church people families witnessed the marriage, and they were considered married, and that was it. But then people started to come to the church door, and remember, the church is not as big as it is now. The bishop would come and they would ask for a blessing. And so then, and I can't remember which one of the Constantinople councils it is, there's some regulation being done because, believe it or not, some priests are blessing these things. And they say, no, it's reserved to the bishop to do that. Only the bishop can give this blessing, which is going to evolve into the nuptial blessing, ultimately. So by the 4th century, not only is there a practice, but some of the early church fathers are saying it has a sacramental character. Some. And it is building up more and more and more and more. And by the time we get to scholasticism with Bonaventure, Aquinas, those characters, most people hold that it has a sacramental character. But it's only in the Reformation time when that is challenged by the Reformers, and they're saying there's only 3 sacraments, Eucharist, baptism, and confirmation, because they're biblically based, and they reject the other ones, that the Council of Trent then comes and it says there are 7 sacraments. And if you deny that, you're anathema. And it's listed as definitively as a sacrament. It's defined as a sacrament. But the reality of the church believed it was a sacrament before that. The Trent didn't make it a sacrament. It was evolving, as all of our faith is always in development. Doctrine is always in development. And as the church reflected upon this experience in the Christian community, they saw a unique, particular holiness being manifested to the church there, and they recognized the holiness in this man and woman. And they saw that the dwelling of God in that, and more evolved and said, this is just not a blessed thing, but this is a sacramental thing. And then the council, because it's disputed, defines it as a sacrament. But there are 4th century patristic writers who see marriage as a sacrament at that time. And then since then, nobody's going to deny it because we don't want to be anathema. So we accept it as one of the 7 sacraments. Okay. But, and so chapter 5 brings up a more delicate thing. We're getting now into reproduction issues. And remember, they start first with the love and then flows to children. In number 50, and this becomes very, very problematic, because the rigorist school held there had to be this absolute openness to reproduction, as I said, and there were other views. And a view that emerges in the commission is responsible parenthood. That parents have to be responsible when they bring children into the world. They just can't. Now, the view held in the canon and articulated in this fight that's going to occur between Cardinal Ottaviani and the commission, and in particular Bernard Herring, is that there could be no, Ottaviani really didn't, the so-called rhythm method didn't even accept that. That Laxus had held that position. And he says any notion of responsible parenthood is absolutely against the Roman Catholic faith, and it cannot be even mentioned. Well, the commission goes on and does this, and it puts it in there. And there's a view that it's not going to be in there. The other thing that comes about, that becomes a big, big fight, is that the commission, and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here, it encourages the different disciplines to continue to explore this question of regulating birth. Now, I'm trying to flip it. Where it says.
In page 5, maybe, where you have like the double lines.
Yeah, but we'll find it in there. Oh, here on page 5, the double line, the first double line, it says, those two who are skilled in other sciences, notably the medical, biological, social, psychological, all the group there, can considerably advance the welfare of marriage and family along with peace of conscience if by pooling their efforts they labor to explain more thoroughly the various conditions favoring a proper regulation of birth. He said, it cannot be discussed. We don't encourage this to do. You don't tell doctors to think about these things. You don't tell psychologists to think about this. And now remember, in 1954, the Congregation of the Holy Office, through the voice of Monsignor Felice, said that to go to a psychiatrist or psychologist, a Catholic was in the state of mortal sin. So now, we used to laugh when I was at the seminary, they say, in 54 you went to hell. Now, in 2004, you can't get in the seminary without going to one. But as you see, ideas progress. And so any kind of intuition that's going to encourage this kind of thinking, Ottaviani says no. Peretti kicks his heels, screams and hollers in perfect Latin, which unfortunately the lay people, because they're only lay people, don't understand a dang word he's saying, and they only find out days later what he said, and by that time they had moved forward and the document was being sent to the desk of Pope VI. So, and now the council, to avoid some of these explosive exchanges in the Basilica, have the system that the commission has a draft. This is a change at the last session. The theological commission is going to review it with comment, but can't make changes. And this is where you're going to see that to say responsible parenthood, you're going to get that comment there. You're going to get these little commentaries coming from Cardinal Ottaviani. Now, in fairness to the man, he came from a big family, and most probably they were happy. Okay, and then it's going to go ultimately, but in between the council and this is Paul VI. And he has reserved to himself to review the documents and to see if they were ready to go to the floor. And if you remember the Time magazine where he made 19 changes in a few documents, okay, and he would do that. But he gets this document and reads through it and reads what has been said and says the document is ready to go to the floor. So he moves it forward. Now I have to go from one of my research books to do the next because the math escapes me. There is lively discussion, incredible discussion. And bishops in very poor countries stand up. Some feel, the bishops in Africa say, I think you're overdoing this. They want polygamy out. They said, you don't understand where we're at in the development of Christianity, and to come up that strong could create obstacles to evangelization. And the common solution in the 50s and well into now is if there's polygamy, the people are Christianized but not baptized. And then on their deathbed, they're baptized, because it has all kinds of economic consequences for a man to set aside all but one wife, because she's just thrown out into the street. So it's opportunistic, to say, well, you come to church, you pray with us, you're not part of the active sacramental system, but at your death, you receive the fullness of the church, because in life, and now, I'm sure there are some people who say, I'm willing to take this courageous act and provide for this way. But the pastor has, pastorally, what I saw in the missions, the priest is a problem to say, set the lynches aside and follow Christ. And then what injustice are you doing to 2 or 20 or 100 women who are not going to be accepted back by their family and who are integrated into a family economic unit? They're not working for General Motors. They're working in an economic unit of family. So these pastoral things are very, very important. And these bishops are not afraid to enlighten the whole church about these challenges. It's a pastoral constitution. So it's inevitable this is going to come up. Well, ultimately, there's all these debates. There's a view that some of these phrases are going to open up discussion about birth control and stuff in a more dynamic way. So finally, it's called to a vote, and that's why I need this to get the votes. Okay, and now this is not the final, is to approve the text. There's always these stages of votes. So the first vote is, if I'm not placed again here, 2,157, what we would call, yes, is the book I'm touching here, placet or yes. Okay, remember they vote placet, it pleases them. Okay. 72 vote non-placet or no. And 484 vote placet justum modum. And remember we talked about justum modum. I agree, but I have some reservations. So we're talking basically a ballpark figure of 500 bishops who have serious reservations about the text, enough that they will only give a qualified vote. Again, procedurally, they have to, if they want to be heard, they have to write a modi. They have to express their doubt or reservation. So what happens, this commission, remember there are lay people there and bishops and theologians, and they receive 500 roughly modi, which is a bishop writing out what's his concern. And according to Bernard Herring, who writes an essay right after a year within the council, because of the urgency of the council's coming to an end, they break these up into little groups of lay people, theologians, and bishops. And they try to read them and categorize them what they are. Something also happens in the big fight that occurs. The chair of this chapter will be John Deere, because the feelings are so strong and he's not exactly aligned. He becomes the chairman of the chapter on the family and marriage. And he's the Archbishop of Detroit, but are very good Latinists. So they break up into all these little groups, process these 500 things that bishops are saying what their problem is. What would you think some of their problems were? Anybody? But sister, you got me.
Well, how to regulate the size of their family.
That's one of the flashpoints that they're going to bring out. And what do you think their concerns are? Well, what happens when these poor souls so going through this thing 24/7. They're working through the night. They have shifts. They just keep working and working and working. Remember, all this has to be put on little index cards, summaries, précia. So they go from Modi to Nota. They have to make these Nota, and the lay people have to do it too. Now they're trying to find vernacular for them to work on. So what happens is when they sort the Nota, roughly 50% of the bishops say the document is too progressive, and 50% say it's too conservative. That the document is not open to development, especially on the issue of regulation of birth. So, what are they doing with this thing? So they're trying to deal with the motive one way or the other. And in the end, when the final vote is taken on this document, there will be 42 bishops who vote no, 4 null votes. They don't know what they're how they're voting, because bishop can't vote anymore, and the rest vote for the document in the final product. So it's supported quite highly, and there's, like, say, roughly 2,290 bishops voting on this vote. So in the end, they were able to put this all together. But what Herring and Dearden, who you may not remember, that after the council there was this very prestigious group of bishops and cardinals who went around the country to major cities and gave these seminars. Cardinal Wright was one of them. He was a big liturgy. He talked about the document on the liturgy. And Dearden was the one that talked about Gaudium et Spes and things of this sort. But he said the most shocking experience for the commission on the family was the split vote. That there was 50% of the Modi felt the document was there. They really thought the objections were going to be from the side of the kind of the Ottaviani group there. And so they were trying to work it out in the end. Now remember, there's a special commission dealing with birth control going on that was appointed. Remember, John the 23rd and Paul the 6th renews it and expands it. So the Crowleys of Chicago were on that commission. So they kind of placate this problem here by saying, ultimately, here's what's going to happen. Your voice will be heard in the commission. And these ultimately get there. After the council, they're sent there to continue to work this specialized group. And Bernard Herring and others are on that commission too. So there's a continuity between the council and the Birth Control Commission, which ultimately we get from Vitae in '68. So this particular document takes a lot of energy in the last session to get through as a whole, but also in part because of certain flashpoints that are there. So any questions about marriage and family? Now today, most probably many of you say, well, I don't have any problems saying sex is a good thing. And these questions that were raised in the manuals are no longer questions. And if a woman goes through menopause, daddy and mommy they don't want your father to say, now what do we do? Do we get separate bedrooms? Or nowadays you don't get that kind of stuff. But the old men in our community used to get those kind of questions. What should we do, Father? You were too progressive.
Yes.
So that's where we go. So we're okay with this, and I strongly, again, I implore you, read the documents themselves and read them not only from a theological but a spiritual view. Okay, so now I'm going to skip chapter 2 because there's really, what you see is what you get there. Basically, culture is defined by all the things that give us meaning, the ways of thinking, our customs, all those things. What makes me a little Dutch boy? and what makes you a little German girl or an Irish guy or whatever. All those things that we identify with our culture, and they're talking about there's holiness in that, and there's value to that, and we shouldn't destroy it. Now let's move to the economic question. Again, how did they start? Some characteristics of economic life today. And they're going to note how there's a gradualism, which you and I take for granted, but and you don't need this right away. It seems to the Council Fathers that the economy is becoming global. No, I'm surprised. Again, remember, we're talking 50 years ago. There's a tendency for more developed countries, which what they're talking about is industrialization. Industrializations to insert themselves in less developed agricultural societies and exploit the people there. So they're like, and at that time, if you remember, there were multinational corporations. They're going into countries and they're exploiting the resources, the labor, and all this kind of stuff. They're seeing this trend being given, and they see certain negative dimensions to it. But they're also seeing a sharing of technology and the possibilities of development, because there's always an optimistic side in the document. They never, oh, woe is me. They're always seeing opportunities for unity, development, and things of this sort. So that's the first thing they're going to talk about. And then they're going to talk about what is authentic economic development. And during this time, Herr Joseph Marie Lebray is working on this commission, and he has done all kinds of extensive research and working with projects on human development, especially in poor countries. So he's worked in Brazil, he's worked in France, and all these different things. Close links, many of the people who are working on this. It's not the same commission as the family, a different group of people. Have had a lot of contact with like the priest worker movement in France and Belgium. They have been working in third world countries in development and things of this sort. Some of these people are very prestigious Catholics who have worked like in the United Nations and in the Red Cross. So they're coming with an encore international. And so they bring out richness to the discussion. So they're talking about, okay, we have this development occurring, but what is proper development? Just because you can, do you do it? Another dimension, and this is, and Chenu is jumping like a little fly from one cookie to the next. I'm getting his word there. Chenu had written a theology of work in the late 1940s and was put on the index and was told not to write about work anymore. Because the dominant theology of work was it was rooted in original sin. Okay, and this was part of our affliction, childbirth, work, things like that. And it was always had this, and there were many prayers in the church that as you would pray that God would help you to accept your state in life, your lot in life. Okay, and I have some of those holy cards where it says, God, help me to be a poor person, a better poor person, or a better worker, and things like that. There was no kind of idea of like emancipation and development. It's still a feudal idea. You're a vassal, you're going to stay a vassal. And Chenu develops, he goes to another source. He goes to the Summa Contra Gentalis of St. Thomas, and St. Thomas says, what is the highest title any human being would have? To answer. Now he's writing to the infidels, the Muslims. He's trying to explain Christianity to the Muslims. And he says the highest title anybody could be called is a co-creator with God. That it's not a punishment, but we have actually been given the earth for development. And every time we work and we make the earth, we're actually participating in the Father Creator's life. And so to have that title is our highest title. So he draws from it, he develops this positive theology of work, and you say, well, what's the big problem? But he's also encouraging workers to claim their dignity and try to make a better life for themselves, and unions, it's all that is, even though the papacy is saying, they can have these unions and stuff, it's a little bit too aggressive for the spirit of the times. So they're being toned down. And part of his thing is leisure. Leisure is absolutely necessary in relationship to work, because it is in leisure that we discover the plan of the Creator and then authentically can participate in creation. So the first section is developing this idea. But now we're going to hit a lightning rod. Remember, this is the Cold War, and atheistic communism has a position formally, which we know was not quite what they did, was that of the corporate state, the totalitarian corporate state, that all property belongs to the state, and the workers participate in this view that was there. And so if you look at these social encyclicals from Leo the 13th up to John the 23rd, there's an affirmation of a long-held doctrine back to the early church, but again, it's about emphasis, a nuance. It's nuanced, toned down. And this is, again, the bull in the china closet. Chenu says, we got to come out and lay it out there. And I said, well, maybe the church is not ready for this, which meant maybe they weren't ready for it. But paragraph 69, which I gave you, basically lays out the formal tradition of the Christian church from the beginning. God intended the earth and everything it contained for the use of all human beings and peoples. Thus, under the leadership of justice and in the company of charity, created goods should be in abundance for all in like manner. Whatever forms of property may, as adapted to the legitimate institutions of people according to diverse and changeable circumstances, attention must always be paid to the universal destiny of created goods. In using them, therefore, people should regard the external things that he legitimately possesses not only as his own, but as common in the sense that they should be able to benefit not only himself but also others. On the other hand, the right of having a share in earthly goods sufficient for one's self and for one's family belongings to everyone. The fathers and the doctors of the church held this opinion, teaching that men are obliged to come to the relief of the poor and to do so not merely out of their superfluous goods. 10, the footnote, which I couldn't just do. They're quoting the Summa of St. Thomas. And again, he illustrates this. He says, if there was a man who was not able to obtain work to provide for himself and his family, and he went to others and asked for assistance, and they turned him down, he says he can take the necessity of his family from others, and it's not stealing. Because the first principal property is the common good. And some of us who might have had Dominican sisters in grade school were taught that in the 6th grade, but some schools didn't get that. They put it in a footnote because they don't want to send to Stalin or Khrushchev or whoever's in power there. They don't want to get the idea this corporate state totalitarian possession of property is in some way we're giving them a signal. So they put it in a footnote there to go along because they said they fight about this. If one is in extreme necessity, he has the right to procure for himself what is needed out of the riches of others. Since there are so many people prostrate with hunger, and the Sacred Council urges all, both individuals and governments, to remember the aphorism of the fathers: feed the man dying of hunger, because if you do not feed him, you have killed him. and really to share and employ these earthly goods according to the ability of each, especially by supporting individuals and people, the aid by which they may be able to help and develop one another. Then they go on and they say customs and traditions will organize the use of private property in relationship to the common good. And at this point in the discussion, as I say, it becomes quite heated. And the fear is, in some way, to legitimize this reality of communism. That's very real. And not only is it real, but it is an aggressive enemy of religion in all states and forms. So they're always trying to kind of be sensitive to this. But when they're moving out into the world, they have to be aware of all kinds of political realities and what they're doing and the consequences for these things when we speak in public. It gets into these areas of investments, money, ownership, private property, and the large estates. And here you're going to see a kind of a walking carefully, because many of the areas where the church lives, where there are these large estates, are in colonial Latin America. And we just, as our parish goes into the sister parish, part of the history of El Salvador was 14 families basically owned the country, and they started a civil war, a 12-year civil war over this. So what they say about things like that these large estates do not serve the common good and do not respect the common ownership of things, but gradually they should be disassembled, and issues of justice to the owners should be put into the equation. They shouldn't just be seized and given away, but in some kind of way. So all these things that they're speaking of have a transitional, gradualist approach to these issues as they look at them. They name them for what they are. Now, why would you look at investment? Investment had been under suspicion and condemned by the Catholic Church for 1700 years because it involves usury. And so that ultimately had to be. The institutional juridical expression of the council still held that to take interest on money was morally suspicious. And even though by this time they have a Vatican bank. But they were very gradual, but the other view is saying this was resolved in the 17th century by the people who were around that time, So that was there. And also money. Money has a long history in the church. The Roman Empire had money and things of this sort. But in the Middle Ages, in the feudal system, it was mainly a barter system of relationships. But as the profit economy starts to develop in the late 12th and the 13th century, money is critical to it because they're doing trade and things of the sort. And those who governed the church at the time were very suspicious of this, because what is the value of money? What is money in itself? We have gold and silver coins and things like that. There's innate value to it. But now, because of many factors, including the Crusade, we're into script, and people have paper money or like deposit tickets of wealth and things of this sort. And the view of the 11th to 13th century theological view was that there was something wrong with it, and it was dirty. And so, in fact, Christians were forbidden to get into all these businesses, and it becomes the monopoly of the Jewish people. And it was also viewed that this script and stuff, as it was referred to, as the excrement of the devil. Now, if you go to medieval cathedrals, especially in France, it's usually on the left portico and the lower end, because that's where the condemned are going to be celebrated, or sometimes called the Michael door. You will see little devils pooping coins out. And unfortunately, there's often a little Jew with a bag catching them, in the things there. And that's been controversial in France, should they be removed or not, and stuff like that. But so they're kind of working this out. But they're also saying, yes, we can understand the church's caution about money, because it's can be easily manipulated, as we all know. We can deflate the dollar. I mean, and there's views, if you read the business section of the major newspapers, there's a view about the national debt that we should let inflation take off and pay back our debtors, China and so forth, with inflated dollars, and then we paid it off because what they borrowed was not gold, they borrowed dollars. And so money can be manipulated in ways that gold and silver coins and precious metals cannot. And so there's a caution about it, but at the same time, it's saying in itself it's not inherently wrong, but it has to be regulated by principles of justice. So basically, this is the type of discussion that's going on in this section here. And then it ends, and we will see that when we go to part 1, and that this section kind of ends almost like what a doxology or prayer of praise. And we'll see this in the first section on principles. There are circles. There's discussion, and then it ends in kind of almost like a prayer. And then it discusses this next loop, and it ends with kind of a theological doxology. And so it talks about the kingdom of God, and it values the material order, but it also, we don't confuse it with the ultimate kingdom in its fullness, but we see it as part of the kingdom. That what we are materially is part of the whole process of creation and the divine plan, and it finds its goodness in the common good. That's where the holiness of the material order and the economy come from. So this document is very complex in the sense because its methodology is so different than every other document in the council. And in the future, I'm sure you'll read these things, but if you see the method, you can kind of understand what's going on. But always you start with the experience, move towards principles and issues, and then come to applications. And so if you think about it in the context of spiritual direction, or you just wanted to come and talk to a priest or somebody, if you listen today in the post-Vatican II church, the first thing the priest will do, if he's following this method, he'll listen to you. What's the situation? Okay. Well, I just stabbed my husband to death. No, okay, that's important information we want to take note of here, and so forth. Where in the past, people would say, Father, what does the church teach about this? And he would say, well, Trent says this, and it's reconfirmed by Kelsey, this, that, and the other. And you give a theological doctrinal answer. In this process here, well, why did you kill him? Well, he had a gun who could blow my brains out. Well, that changes the situation. So you're not going to quote the Fifth Commandment to her, but it's going to be you see how it actually in the practical, parochial, day-to-day life of the church, how it changes the church? And today, that's how people are trained in seminaries today. That first you understand the situation. So in the Human Volunteer Corps, when we talk about doing a project, we have to be informed about the project. We're going to help hunger in the city. Who's hungry? Why are they hungry? What is the institutions here doing for them? What does the city council give a concern for the hungry people, or is it all up to individuals? You start there, and then you say, but our faith, even though they're slackers and they won't help, they're neglecting their obligations, we, because of Christ, called holiness, we're going to feed them, in spite of the fact that we have a terrible mayor and all of this. I don't know, just an example, I don't want to trash anybody. But it affects us day to day in the church. And those of us who are older remember another time when we were taught the principles, but the context was lost. So that's a big change with documents fast. And we're going to pick up this document next week, and then I'm going to pull our time together. So, in case I should